Matt Dunlap. Matt was former Secretary of State in the state of Maine. Now he's like the big shot auditor in the state of Maine. Matt is somebody that I got to know through the American Council on Young Political Leaders, and we traveled Russia together for 15 days, and I relied on Matt a lot. His knowledge of Russia, his, he was the perfect person to be alongside of when we were doing this. He understands it. He understands a lot about Russia that most people aren't going to pick up on. And so I called him and said, Matt, come on with us. I mean, let's just talk for a while. And he said, sure, I'll do that. So Matt Dunlap, good to have you on News and Views, sir.
Hey, Joel, it's great to be back on the show. It's a great show. And just to give my own show a plug, I'm going to be hosting Maine Outdoors next Sunday night, talking about youth programs for wildlife education on WVOM 103.9 here in Maine.
There we go. I got to check it out, Matt. I do. I got to check it out. I know that that's a passion of yours as well. So, Matt, when you see this whole thing playing out, what's your first impression when you see what Vladimir Putin is doing to the Ukrainian people?
Well, it's heartbreaking. After you and I went to Russia as part of that delegation, it was covered. My trip there was covered by the Maine media, and I had some folks reach out to me from the sister city committee of Greater Portland and Archangel, which is way up in northern Russia, about latitudinally equivalent to the top of Hudson's Bay. And I've been over there a bunch of times, and we've hosted some delegations. And, when we went that first time, I think we all kind of had some assumptions about what we were going to see, because we'd grown up in the Cold War. In fact, my parents moved to Maine from Chicago partly because they were terrified of the idea of a nuclear war. They wanted to get out of the city. And that was what we grew up with. And we had this impression that Russians were grim people who wanted to conquer the world. And what we saw was completely different. These warm people who welcomed us. They wanted to share their lives with us. And that's what I've seen every time I've gone over, and with every group that's come to Maine. It's just friendship. And so when this broke out and we saw the run up to it, and nobody could really believe that Putin was going to actually invade Ukraine. And then he did. And I reached out to some folks in the sister city committee and said, what's the temperature over there? And what we're hearing is that people are despondent. They're heartbroken by this. And it's really hard to get that because, state media in Russia is so tightly controlled. And Putin has kind of reverted back to the Soviet days where you're looking at 15 years in prison for protesting. And people are told, smile or get arrested. And that's just what the reason why we started these exchanges was to stop all that. It's about people to people and understanding each other. So I hope that we don't lose sight of what's happening in Russia as well as what's happening in Ukraine throughout this entire tragedy.
Well, and where Matt is just so spot on, right? Excuse me. The people of Russia, everybody wakes up and it's like, okay, this is the evil. This is the people of Russia don't get up in the morning and think about the United States of America. They don't.
No.
They go about living their lives just like we do and trying to do the best for themselves and their family just like we do. The problem that I see, Matt, is that, if we have a tyrant as a leader, there's a process to take that tyrant out. Where in Russia, that in the end is everything that you and I worked on was a means of getting the type of relationships to where someday you were going to see a McDonald's in Russia.
Yeah.
And now McDonald's is saying we don't want to do business in Russia. And so if he did anything else to his own country, he did that. He took away the commerce, the ability for people to collectively do commerce together. And I just can't understand his motivation, Matt.
Yeah, to what end? To what end, really? I mean, last time I was there, the ruble was worth about 35 cents to the dollar. Now it's worth less than 3/4 of a penny. I mean, he's destroyed the Russian economy. And this is one of the things I think that, the United States and the European allies have done really, really well as they've banded together on these sanctions. I mean, sanctions we roll our eyes at sanctions. Are they ever effective? Well, when everybody participates, it's pretty darn effective. And you're seeing that Putin and Russia is paying a really, really heavy price for this so-called special military operation that's taking place right now.
Matt, go back in time a little bit, because when people think of Russia, they think as far back as maybe Lenin, certainly Stalin. They don't look at we in the United States are sitting here in a country that was, we think of 1776. Other countries just laugh at that. We're new to them yet. Oh, yeah. When you think of the Russian people and their leaders, what do you think of, Matt?
Well, you go back to, really a couple thousand years, really. When we were in Moscow, if you remember, they have what they call the rings, the ring roads that go around Moscow. And that was the series of outer walls as Moscow grew. I mean, it was a walled city because it was under constant assault from the Mongols, it's always been a society that's been informed by the tragedy of war and invasion. It's got a long history under the czars. Of course, that was all, undone through that series of catastrophes in World War I, and then, of course, the Russian Revolution. And when I went up to the Solovetsky Islands, which is way up in the White Sea, and it's home to this, I think it was like a 15th century monastery that is behind this enormous fortress that was built by the Tsar to protect the monastery from invasion. So that's part of what informs Russia's mindset. I mean, we don't think about that. The last time we fought a land war against a foreign power in the United States was the War of 1812. We don't have any collective memory of this. When we were in Leningrad or St. Petersburg, you remember, I mean, the museum of, the blockade with the memorials to the 1 million+ people that starved to death in the 1940s under that siege. So Russia has, their collective memory is one of constantly being under assault. And I think that, that's sort of what's informed a lot of the support for Putin, because when we were there, if you remember, one of our translators said that they kind of missed the communists because when their communists were there, at least the power didn't go off for 4 hours a day. That transition from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation was a pretty painful one. Yeah. Putin has largely dialed it all back to what it was before. And I think the Russians have allowed that to happen, partly because they sort of welcomed it. Not everybody did. There's been sort of this patina of openness that has now been shut off. But when I was there, maybe 10, 15 years ago, Putin had already moved through the Duma the provision that changed the regional governors from being elected to his appointment. He controls 75% of the Duma and the Russian Federation Council. So that's a pretty consolidated level of control, and I think that's part of the problem. Like you mentioned, there's no checks and balances there now.
Yeah, when you look at, we were talking about Western culture and the role it can play in, a more free Russia, for lack of a better way of putting it. You have to ask yourself what people expect versus what they're going to deliver. Like Matt said, they just wanted the power to be on. Well, once you have the power on and once you have it on consistently, you take that for granted. And, are Russians today taking for granted something that sanctions have taken away from them? I always call it the Google, ladies and gentlemen. If you do the Google on Matt Dunlap from Maine, what you're going to find is a public servant and someone who understands many things in life, not the least of which what Russia is like. He's been there a number of times. I think, Matt, the first time you went was with me when we spent 15 days. Okay, and then you took that to a whole nother place after that. But I wanted to ask you about the Russian people after they've been exposed, which they have, to things in their lifestyle that we take for granted. Do they now take them for granted, and have they lost them during sanctions to the point where they're like, wait a second, something isn't working in leadership here?
Well, it comes down to the core question. What does a Russian person want? What do they want for themselves? And you know what they want? They want the same things we want. They want a better life for themselves. They want a more secure future for their kids. They want access to education. They want access to all the amenities that make life worth living. And it goes beyond just stuff like that we take for granted, like, restaurants like McDonald's and things like that. It's access to the world. And that's been shut off from them. And, you're seeing thousands of people fleeing Russia right now. They're going to Turkey. They're going to the Baltic states, wherever they can get out. A lot of people have left. Now, that's out of a context of like a country of hundreds of millions of people. You have 20 or 30,000 already that have gone to Istanbul. But it speaks to something. You see Russia from the Cold War period, where you could not get certain things. You couldn't get meat, for example. Meat was very, very difficult to get. You couldn't get a telephone. You couldn't, if you were to buy a car, you had to like save the money up and then go with this wad of money to whoever could sell you a car. And that's, there wasn't a banking system that we take for granted. And that's been now well established, but now that's on the brink of collapse. So, I think, we see the sanctions as hitting Putin, but it hits regular Russian people too. And that's something to bear in mind. If you remember when, a couple of years ago when the pandemic hit, here in Maine, price of gasoline dropped to $1.50 a gallon. And one of the things that we were very cognizant of was that cheap gas wasn't good for everybody. You look at the oil industry in the Midwest and the Dakotas. People were really, really hurting from that. And I think that's what, you see happening in Russia too, that, people are going to be profoundly affected by this for a long, long time. And it probably won't get fixed, honest to God, until Putin's out. He's got a pretty firm grip on that country right now. And I'm not sure how effective the sanctions are going to be towards deterring him to a different course.
We think of things in terms of administrations. We don't think of things in terms, and that goes back to my point earlier about, the history of Russia versus the history of the U.S. We're always the Obama administration or the Bush administration, but I want to go back to that. Condoleezza Rice, I saw a piece with her talking about, when they floated Crimea and when they floated Ukraine being potentially placed into NATO. And George W. Bush was talking about that. And, she said that wasn't our best moment. So how big of a role did that play in Putin and the rest of the leaders in Russia being nervous about losing any semblance of control on their borders?
I think it's part of a series of events that did play a strong role in all that. Look at what happened in 2014 when, and of course, that was a different scenario. And I think this is part of the miscalculation that Putin has made, where you look at 2014 when they took Crimea, the president of Ukraine was basically trying to drive Ukraine back towards Russia, and he was ousted for it. And that same week was when they launched that incursion into Crimea, and the admiral of the Ukrainian Navy in the area, actually the second day of the incursion, defected to the other side. Half the Ukrainian military in Crimea defected to the other side. And I think, even Putin said that he couldn't believe how easy it was. But that was a different framework. The Ukrainian government was kind of split. It was in disarray. And I think what he expected was he could sort of waltz into Ukraine and have this all done in a couple of days. And that's not been the case because, Zelensky has transformed that government and transformed the military and has pushed it more towards the West, which is really what Putin can't tolerate. And that worldview that Putin has is of the Russian Empire, which, the czars and the Bolsheviks had to have an iron grip to hold together. And when that iron grip began to relax in the early 90s, with glasnost and perestroika, it just completely blew apart. And there's no way you can hold something like that together unless you have an iron grip. And I think that's what we see in these types of autocracies. And we have a lot of debates in this country, and sometimes I think we find ourselves incredibly divided but I think everybody believes in America. Likewise in Russia. I was in Archangel for City Day a few years ago, a great summertime festival, and they had this guy. He's sort of the Russian version of Tom Jones. He had this really big, awful hairpiece, and he gets on the stage because the city square is filled with, probably 30,000 people. And he starts singing these old patriotic songs from World War II. Joel, everybody in the audience knew every word to every song, because they'd lived through that terrible, terrible time of the Great Patriotic War. That's what they call it. When 26 million Russians were killed in World War II. We can't even begin to identify with something like that. And one of the things I've observed about Russians, you go to North Dakota, or you go to New Mexico, or Maine, or Florida, you're going to meet people who sort of embody that region, right? You're going to meet the lobsterman on the coast of Maine, the rancher in North Dakota, or wherever. You go to Russia, you meet somebody who's Russian, they are Russia. They have that whole, whole social, psychological history in their heart.